As silence filled the room, a single human ship, no larger than a speck against the vastness of the Armada, had destroyed one of their most powerful vessels with a single shot. The very thought of it was incomprehensible. How could such a small ship, with no real weapons or apparent strength, have done something so catastrophic? The fleet's sensors scrambled to make sense of what had happened. The human ship was still there, hovering in space, completely unaffected by the attack it had just launched. No damage, no signs of distress. It was as if the ship was indestructible. The Armada's commanders now realized something they had never thought possible. This was no ordinary enemy. The humans were different. The moment the first warship of the Galactic Armada exploded, a wave of disbelief swept across the fleet. The commanders had expected a fight, perhaps even an intense battle. But nothing like this. 1 minute, everything had been normal, and the next, a single human warship had obliterated one of their largest vessels with a single shot. Panic quickly spread through the command center as officers scrambled to understand what had just happened. The ship had been one of the Armada's flagship destroyers, a behemoth with layers of reinforced armor and shields capable of withstanding the most intense bombardments. Yet, a small human vessel had cut through it like a hot knife through butter. General Darren's hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he stared at the flickering holo display in front of him. He couldn't believe it. He had been in charge of the Armada for decades, overseeing the fall of countless civilizations, but he had never seen anything like this before. The human ship, still hanging in space, looked no different from a typical reconnaissance vessel. It was small, almost insignificant compared to the massive fleet he commanded. Its sleek design was nothing compared to the bulk of the Armada's warships. There was no way such a ship could possess such power, no way it could have taken down one of their best ships with such ease. And yet, here it was, staring them in the face, seemingly untouched, as if mocking the Armada's superiority. "Report," Darren barked, his voice laced with panic. He needed to understand how this had happened, why this had happened. Lieutenant Garrow quickly analyzed the data, his fingers moving nervously across his control panel. "Sir, the energy blast. It wasn't like any weapon we've encountered before. It doesn't match anything in our database. It was almost as if the energy itself was alive." The lieutenant's voice faltered, and there was no impact to the human ship. The weapon's power wasn't just extraordinary, it was beyond anything we've ever seen. Darren clenched his fists. He had faced countless threats in his time, but this was something else. The fact that they were dealing with a completely unknown weapon was enough to send a chill down his spine. The fleet had never faced anything they couldn't understand or predict, and that was precisely what made this situation so terrifying. Their usual tactics, overwhelming firepower, relentless attacks, and superior numbers, meant nothing against this enemy. The human ship was using some kind of advanced technology that defied everything the Armada knew. It wasn't just a challenge, it was an insult to their supremacy. "Order all ships to engage the human vessel," Darren commanded, his voice now firm with resolve. "We will overwhelm it. We have the numbers. We are the Galactic Armada." But as soon as the orders were given, something strange began to happen. The human ship didn't try to flee, didn't make any attempt to retreat or even defend itself in the traditional sense. Instead, it slowly maneuvered, its movements precise and calculated, as if it had already anticipated every move the Armada was about to make. The fleet's heavy warships closed in, firing their massive weapons. The energy beams from their cannons lit up the dark void of space, streaking toward the human ship with incredible speed. But each time, the human ship seemed to effortlessly avoid the blasts. It wasn't fast, at least not in the way the Armada's ships were, but its movements were deliberate, as if it knew the precise moment to shift, the exact trajectory to follow. It was more like a chess master, carefully planning each move, than a ship just trying to survive. Then, to the fleet's horror, the human ship responded. A single devastating pulse of energy shot out from the ship, striking one of the Armada's smaller cruisers dead center. The cruiser had no chance. Its shields flickered for a fraction of a second before collapsing, and then the entire ship simply vanished. There was no explosion, no debris. It was as though the cruiser had been erased from existence, reduced to nothing in an instant. Impossible, General Darren hissed under his breath. He had seen ships destroyed before, but this was different. This wasn't just a blast tearing through the armor. It was a weapon that erased the very existence of their ships. It was beyond their understanding. It was like the human warship could manipulate space itself, bending reality to its will. The remaining commanders exchanged looks of uncertainty, their confident expressions now replaced with fear. They had underestimated the humans. No, they had completely misjudged them. They had thought it would be an easy victory, a routine exercise to remind the galaxy of the Armada's power. Now, they were fighting for their very survival. The human warship was not a random anomaly. It was a highly advanced weapon, and it was capable of wiping out entire fleets with terrifying ease. Darren slammed his fist against the console in frustration. "We have to stop it," he muttered. But deep down, he wasn't sure if they could. For the first time in years, the Galactic Armada found itself facing something it couldn't control, something it couldn't predict or defeat. The human warship had shown them one undeniable truth: the galaxy was no longer theirs to command. And it was a truth they were not ready to accept. As the battle raged on, the once feared Galactic Armada found itself in chaos. The human warship continued to defy all logic, dodging every attack with almost supernatural precision. It wasn't just the speed at which it moved, but the way it seemed to read the Armada's every move. Every time the fleet's warships launched their weapons, the human ship would shift, almost as if it were anticipating the attack before it even happened. The fleet's officers, who had never doubted the might of the Armada, were now beginning to panic. General Darren's mind raced, trying to figure out what was going wrong. This wasn't a battle. This was something else entirely. The human ship wasn't just a ship, it was a weapon, and it was more advanced than anything they had ever encountered. The energy pulses it launched were unlike anything the Armada had ever seen, tearing through the armor of their ships like paper. It wasn't just the power of the attacks that terrified Darren, but the speed at which they happened. There was no time to retaliate, no time to prepare countermeasures. The human ship was outthinking them at every turn. One of the fleet's senior officers, Admiral Talder, stood frozen at his station, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We're losing control," he muttered under his breath. "We've lost 2 ships in the last few minutes. The human warship is destroying us with ease. What do you suggest we do?" General Darren snapped, his voice cracking. "We can't just sit here and be obliterated." Talder looked at the general, his face pale. "We need a new strategy, something we haven't tried yet. The human ship is clearly more advanced than we thought. Perhaps we can overwhelm it with sheer force." Darren nodded slowly, unwilling to admit it, but realizing that Talder was right. The Armada's greatest strength had always been its overwhelming numbers, and that was exactly what they needed now. They had to use their numbers to their advantage, even if the human warship had proven so far to be almost invincible. "Form a perimeter," Darren ordered. "Surround the human ship. Get every available warship into position. We need to trap it. Don't give it any escape route." The fleet commanders rushed to carry out the orders, but even as they did, a sinking feeling began to settle in their hearts. The Armada was vast, but the human ship was something different. Even if they surrounded it, could they really destroy it? Could they overcome a ship that had already wiped out 2 of their best vessels without breaking a sweat? But there was no turning back now. The fleets moved into position, lining up around the human ship. The darkness of space was lit up with the glow of hundreds of weapons charging, energy beams building up for one final assault. The commanders were ready to unleash everything they had. If the human ship was going to fall, it would be here, in the heart of the Armada. With a single command, the entire fleet fired. The barrage of energy blasts shot through space like a storm, aiming to overwhelm the human ship from all sides. The power of the combined assault should have been enough to vaporize any ordinary ship in an instant. But the human warship didn't flinch. Instead, it did something that none of the fleet's officers had predicted. It didn't try to dodge or deflect the attacks. It absorbed them. The energy from the fleet's weapons seemed to disappear as it reached the human ship's shields. There was no explosion, no feedback from the impact. The beams of light simply vanished, as if they were swallowed by an invisible force. Even more shocking was the fact that the human ship didn't show a single sign of damage. No shields flickering. No signs of distress. It was as though the weaponry of the entire Armada was useless against it. Admiral Talder's eyes widened in disbelief. How? How is it doing that? Darren's voice was cold and steady, but his mind was racing. This wasn't a warship. This was something else. The human ship was not just surviving the barrage. It was absorbing it, as if it were feeding on the energy. It was turning the Armada's strength into its own power. A low hum began to fill the command deck, growing louder with every passing second. General Darren looked up in confusion. What is that noise? It took a moment for the officers to realize what was happening. The human warship was charging its weapons, gathering the energy it had just absorbed, and it was about to unleash it back at them. Before anyone could react, a bright, blinding light filled the space around them. The human ship released a massive energy pulse, far more powerful than anything the fleet had ever witnessed. The blast ripped through space with terrifying speed, aimed directly at the Armada's flagship. The shockwave from the blast hit before the light even reached the ships. It was like a tidal wave of energy, warping the fabric of space itself. Ships in the fleet were thrown off course, their systems overloaded by the sheer power of the pulse. Some vessels exploded before they could even register what had happened. The flagship, the heart of the entire fleet, was the next to fall. Its shields didn't even have a chance to activate before the pulse tore through its hull, tearing it apart in an instant. The fleet's commanders watched in horror as their flagship was reduced to nothing, its once proud form now nothing but debris. The pulse didn't stop there. It continued, spreading outward, ripping through the Armada's lines, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. General Darren could barely comprehend what was happening. Their greatest weapon, the fleet itself, was being dismantled by a single ship. It was no longer a battle. It was a slaughter, and they were on the losing side. The human warship, untouched and unfazed, continued to glide effortlessly through the destruction. It moved like a predator in the midst of its prey, utterly in control. The Armada, once the most feared military force in the galaxy, had been reduced to a shattered wreck, its ships floating in the void like broken toys. Darren's mind was spinning. How could this happen? How had they, the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known, been brought to the brink of extinction by a single human warship? In that moment, he knew that the Galactic Armada was no longer the supreme power of the galaxy. The humans had proven their might, and they had done it without mercy. The devastation was overwhelming. The once proud fleet of the Galactic Armada, which had dominated the stars for centuries, was now in ruins. The human warship had single-handedly torn through their most powerful ships with ease, leaving behind only debris and scattered wreckage. General Darren stood at the helm of what remained of the command ship, his mind racing but unable to find any solution. The battle had turned into a nightmare, and there was no escape. "We're losing," Admiral Talder said quietly, his voice hoarse from the chaos. "We don't have the numbers. We don't have the firepower. This is impossible." Darren didn't respond. He couldn't. His hands shook as he tried to steady himself. For the first time in his life, he was witnessing the downfall of the Galactic Armada, and it was at the hands of a single human warship. The once invincible fleet, which had reduced entire civilizations to ash with just a glance, was being torn apart by a race they had considered insignificant, a race they had underestimated for far too long. The human ship, still hovering in the vastness of space, seemed to be toying with them now. It had taken out the flagship and nearly half the fleet, but it wasn't finishing the job. It was circling them, almost as if it was waiting. Was it giving them a chance to surrender, or was it simply enjoying the destruction? The uncertainty gnawed at Darren's mind, but the reality was clear. Their arrogance had led them here, and now they were paying the price. "General," said Lieutenant Garrow, his voice trembling, "we still have a few ships left in the outer perimeter. We could try one last desperate maneuver, a full-scale counterattack. Perhaps we can overwhelm it with numbers." Darren turned slowly to face Garrow. His eyes were filled with fear and disbelief. "You still think we can overwhelm it?" he asked quietly. "We've already thrown everything we had at it. It absorbed our attacks and turned them against us. What makes you think another assault will work?" Garrow hesitated, then spoke again, his voice quieter. "I'm just trying to find a way out of this." Darren sighed, his face hardening with a new resolve. "You're right. We don't have the luxury of time anymore. We've got to keep fighting, even if it's a lost cause." He turned to the remaining officers. "Prepare what ships we have left. We're going to make one final stand." The remaining ships of the Armada, battered and broken, but not yet defeated, moved into formation. The once proud warships now looked like scavengers, desperate and clinging to life. The remaining officers worked quickly, plotting a final course of action. The human ship, which had so far displayed no hint of weakness, still hovered in place, watching them. There was a strange, eerie silence in the void of space now. As the Armada's ships lined up, ready for one last strike, Darren glanced at the human warship on his monitor. It was smaller than any of the Armada's ships, barely even a fraction of their size. Yet it had shattered their greatest fleet with minimal effort. He couldn't help but wonder how such a thing was possible. What kind of weapon could do this, and what kind of intelligence could wield it? Then, without warning, the human ship fired again, but this time it was different. Instead of a singular blast, it unleashed an entire barrage. Energy beams, pulses, and waves of destructive force. But they weren't aimed directly at the Armada's ships. Instead, they spread out in a way that was almost strategic, targeting their weakest points. The weapons sliced through space with pinpoint accuracy, cutting through the Armada's defensive lines with ease. As the barrage struck, it wasn't just the damage to their ships that shook the remaining fleet. It was the overwhelming realization that the humans were not just fighting with superior technology. They were fighting with superior intelligence. The way they targeted the ships, the way they adapted and countered every move the Armada made, it was as if they had studied the Armada's tactics for years, knowing exactly how they would respond. The human warship was a predator, and the Armada's ships were nothing more than prey. Darren clenched his fists as he watched his fleet crumble. Each attack from the human warship brought a new wave of destruction, and no matter how many ships they threw at it, it felt as if they were fighting an invisible force. The Armada's shields failed in an instant. The remaining ships, small in number, but still formidable, began to retreat, trying to escape the onslaught. But they were too slow. The human ship was everywhere at once, a shadow in the darkness of space, moving faster than they could track. It was a nightmare come to life. "Retreat," Darren shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "All ships, retreat to the outer systems. Now." It was too late. Before any of the ships could react, the human warship fired again. This time, its beam cut through the heart of their retreating formation. One ship after another was struck down, torn apart in an instant. There was no escape. The remaining vessels exploded one by one, their debris floating in the cold silence of space. Darren stood motionless as his fleet was destroyed, every plan, every strategy, every moment of their dominance now reduced to nothing. The once proud Armada had been humbled, its reputation shattered, its power destroyed by a race it had long underestimated. The human ship, seemingly without effort, glided into the center of what remained of the Armada. Darren stared at the screen in front of him. The human vessel was unscathed, its hull gleaming, its weapons still silent. It was as though the human ship had already won, and now it was simply waiting. For the first time in his life, General Darren felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. The human race, which had once seemed so insignificant, had just crushed the mightiest military force in the galaxy, and it had done so without hesitation, without mercy. The Armada was finished, and the humans, they were just getting started. The destruction was complete. General Darren stood amidst the remains of the once unstoppable Galactic Armada, now reduced to mere space debris scattered across the void. The human warship had unleashed its fury, dismantling everything in its path. No ships had escaped. No commanders had survived. The fleet that had once controlled the galaxy was now nothing more than a memory, a shattered relic of an empire that had believed itself invincible. The human ship hovered in the midst of the devastation, silent and still, like a predator surveying its kill. It had won. In less than an hour, it had taken down what had once been the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. General Darren's mind couldn't grasp it. How had it happened? How had they, who had crushed civilizations without hesitation, been brought to the edge of annihilation by a single human warship? Darren's hands gripped the command chair tightly, his knuckles white. He had watched his fleet disintegrate before his eyes, each attack more devastating than the last. The human ship was something entirely different from anything they had faced before. It wasn't just about firepower. It was about intelligence, precision, and an understanding of the battlefield that the Armada had never encountered. And now, it was over. The command room was eerily silent. Officers and crew members, who had once been filled with confidence and pride, now sat in stunned disbelief, their faces pale and haunted by the overwhelming realization of their defeat. The hum of the ship's engines, once a symbol of power, now felt like a funeral dirge. "General," said Lieutenant Garrow, his voice barely a whisper. What do we do now?" Darren's gaze remained fixed on the view screen in front of him. The human warship was still there, hanging motionless in space, as though it was waiting for something, perhaps the final moments of the Armada. The general's mind raced with thoughts of escape, of retreat, but deep down, he knew it was futile. There was nowhere to run. There was no safe haven left. They had fought their hardest, thrown everything they had at the human ship, but it had been as though they were fighting an enemy from another reality, one that could bend space and time to its will. For the first time in his life, General Darren felt the cold grip of true fear. This was no ordinary battle. The humans were not just defending their territory, they were sending a message. The galaxy was no longer theirs to control. Darren stood up from his chair slowly, his movements stiff. He had always prided himself on his ability to strategize, on his skill in navigating the complexities of galactic warfare. But this was something he could never have predicted. The Armada's reputation had been built on the idea that no force could stand against them. Yet now, in the blink of an eye, it had been obliterated by a race that had barely been considered a threat. The sense of superiority that had sustained the Armada for millennia was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of defeat. The human ship moved again, this time in their direction. It didn't rush, but its movements were deliberate, purposeful. It was as though the humans were taking their time, savoring the final moments of the Armada's existence. Darren's heart sank. He had seen the destruction of civilizations before, but nothing like this. The human warship was the harbinger of a new era, one where the Galactic Armada no longer had any place. It was then that Darren realized what the humans were doing. They weren't just destroying them, they were sending a message to the entire galaxy. The days of the Galactic Armada's dominance were over. "General," said another officer, her voice trembling, "they're sending a signal. The human warship, it's transmitting to every corner of the galaxy." Darren's pulse quickened. A signal. What were they trying to tell the galaxy? Without warning, the human ship released a burst of energy into the vastness of space. It wasn't aimed at anything in particular, but rather sent out in all directions, a shockwave of power that rippled across the stars. And then the message came through. It wasn't a typical transmission. There were no words, no symbols, only a simple image, the symbol of the human warship, glowing with an otherworldly intensity. And beneath it, there was a single phrase in the universal language of the galaxy. "We are the new order." The transmission echoed throughout space, reaching every corner of the galaxy, where it would be seen by every race, every species, and every empire that had once cowered before the might of the Galactic Armada. The message was clear. The humans had arrived, and they were no longer the underdogs. They were no longer a species to be ignored. General Darren's heart sank as he realized the full weight of what had just happened. This was not just a military defeat. It was the dawn of a new age. The humans, who had once been nothing more than a footnote in the history of the galaxy, had just claimed their place at the top. For the first time in centuries, the Galactic Armada was no more. And in its place, there was only the promise of a new order, one that would be shaped by the humans and their warships. Darren turned his back to the view screen, his body slumping in defeat. The battle was lost. The Armada was gone. And he, like the rest of his fleet, was powerless to stop what was coming next. As the human warship's message echoed across the galaxy, the realization began to settle in for General Darren and the remnants of his fleet. The battle was over. The Galactic Armada, which had once been the unchallenged rulers of the stars, was no more. Its power was gone, its legend reduced to dust. And the symbol of humanity's rise was now broadcast across the void of space, a new force rising from the ashes of the old. The human warship remained in the same position, no longer attacking, no longer threatening. It had already done its job. It had shattered the Armada's might and sent its message. The rest of the galaxy would hear the warning loud and clear. The humans were now the dominant force, and they would not be ignored. For Darren, the gravity of the situation was almost too much to bear. He had been raised in the belief that the Armada's power was absolute, that no force in the galaxy could ever challenge it. He had seen other civilizations rise and fall, their empires destroyed by the Armada's might. Now, it was his own fleet that had been annihilated, its ships reduced to floating debris in the cold expanse of space. How had it come to this? How had the once proud Armada been brought to its knees by the humans? Darren's mind kept replaying the events that had unfolded, the unimaginable speed at which the human warship had torn through the Armada's forces. Their technology, their weapons, their tactics, it had all been a mismatch, a cruel joke. The Armada's greatest strength, its numbers, had meant nothing against a single ship that had been able to outthink them, outmaneuver them, and destroy them without mercy. The view of the remains of the Armada's fleet on his monitor was a sobering reminder of the futility of their fight. The once great ships of the Armada, now drifting lifelessly through space, were a testament to their arrogance. And in the center of it all, the human warship stood unharmed, its sleek, menacing form a symbol of humanity's dominance. General Darren stood motionless for a long moment, as if waiting for something to change. But nothing did. There was no rescue, no reinforcement coming. The human ship had left no room for doubt. It was in control. And now, all Darren could do was accept the inevitable. Then came the final transmission, the one that would forever mark the end of the Galactic Armada's reign. It wasn't a threat or a command, just a simple statement. It was cold, deliberate, and unyielding, much like the humans themselves. The transmission cut through the remaining frequencies, its words broadcast across the galaxy, reaching every corner of space, every species, every empire. We are the future of this galaxy. The message wasn't just a declaration of victory, it was a proclamation. The humans were laying claim to the stars. There would be no more empires like the Armada, no more civilizations that could believe themselves untouchable. The humans had shown what true power looked like, and they had done so with brutal efficiency. As the transmission ended, Darren could do nothing but stare at the viewscreen, watching the human warship slowly drift away, its engines silent as it turned to leave. The remnants of the Armada's fleet floated lifelessly around him, a broken, defeated force. His thoughts, once sharp and clear, now seemed clouded with despair. The realization hit him fully now. The era of the Galactic Armada was over. They had failed. The silence of space now felt like a tomb. The legacy of the Armada, once filled with stories of conquest and fear, was now gone, erased by the superior might of humanity. The war was won, but the price of victory had been steep for both sides. Darren didn't know what would happen next. The human warship had proven that they were no longer the underdogs. It was clear that humanity was now the galaxy's new force to be reckoned with. What did that mean for the other species who had once bowed to the Armada? What would become of the balance of power in the galaxy? As Darren looked out at the wreckage, the empty void of space seemed to mock him. He couldn't help but wonder what fate awaited his own people. The Galactic Armada had always prided itself on its strength, on its ability to crush any foe in its path. But now, that strength was gone, and in its place, there was only uncertainty. For the first time, the galaxy seemed vast and unfamiliar. The old order had been upended, and there was no telling what the future would bring.